Okay, with our cube selected, if we come over to our Properties panel and click the Material tab, we can go ahead and press New to give this cube a new material. So in the past few videos, we've been discussing all of the basic Blender render material types here, which there are four: surface, which is the default sort of main workhorse. Then we have the wire option, volume option, and finally we can set our material to the type of halo. Now once again, I want to point out that these are all Blender render material options. Right now we are in the Blender render engine, and Cycles uses an entirely different setup to control materials, so just so you're aware of that. So we won't spend too much more time on Blender render materials, but it's a good idea to have some basic knowledge of what's under the hood here. I'm going to go ahead and turn my preview window open and drag it up to the top here. So you probably noticed that when we switched this material type from surface to halo, the cube that is using this material has seemed to vanish, except for these 8 small points. So what's going on here is that when we're using a halo material type, none of the actual surface of the object will show up. Only the vertex points that create the actual object will be used with the halo material type. So if I were to press tab to go into edit mode, press A to select everything, tap W a few times to subdivide this whole cube, then press tab to go back into object mode, notice now we're seeing representation points of this halo material everywhere the vertex points exist on the actual mesh. So down here in my camera window here, if I were to press my render preview button, which brings me a little closer to understanding what the final render will look like, notice that the box has become a sort of glowing orb of light, only it's a bit hard to see, so we'll click on lights and turn down the scene brightness. Go ahead and drop that to 0. And so this is what this cube looks like with the halo material active on it. And notice that for every vertex point on the cube, we're seeing one of these halo effects. You can actually change the way your material is displayed in this little preview if you want. For instance, we could click on this cube or this Suzanne head, and you can see when the halo material type's being used on the Suzanne head example that it's lighting up every vertex point. So if I drag this to make it real big, we can see all the vertex points lit up there like fireflies. But a particularly useful viewing method when working with halo materials is this top plane one, because it allows us to look at just one vertex point, basically focusing in on what the actual halo material will look like for each vertex point. So now that we have our material preview showing us just one halo point, let's go ahead and get our cube object to do the same thing. So with it selected, we can press tab to go into edit mode. And what we want to do, since the halo material will show up where each vertex point exists, let's just merge all these vertices to a single point. So to do that, we can either press T to bring up our tool shelf, select our vertex tools, and press the Merge Vertices button and select at center, or you can just press the hotkey M to bring up that same menu. So even though this object is still called cube, it now only consists of this single vertex point. So if we were to come down here in our camera area and press our render preview button, we can see this single halo point here. If you watch the videos discussing the volume and wire material types, then you'll know that while they can do some really cool things, they've got a really annoying limitation. And that is when using these material types on objects, the material can't really affect other things in the environment. For instance, even though when we come down here and press the render preview button, we see this kind of glowy looking halo effect. If we were to say, press tab to go back into object mode, press shift A and add a plane, have something like this, and let's go ahead and rename this cube from cube, which it isn't anymore, it's just a single vertex point using a halo material, to something that makes more sense, such as halo object here. And press G to grab, pick it out. So this object with this halo material has this kind of glowy effect, so we would expect when pressing the render preview button for that light to bounce off onto the plane, but it doesn't. So things like reflections and emitting light when you're using either the halo, volume, or wire material types aren't going to work. They're basically just going to exist within the environment. That said, you can still do a lot of really super cool things with them, especially the halo type, as we'll see here in a second. So I'll go ahead and click on that plane, press X to delete it, press render preview button to turn that off for now, and click back on the halo objects. Okay, then onto some actual settings. So if we click open the halo menu, we've got this nice set of options here to adjust the way our halo looks on things. So we've got this alpha value, which of course controls transparency. And if I come down here and press my render preview button, we'll get sort of a live update of how this is looking. You can see the lower I make this alpha value, the closer it gets to invisible. So like that. Then we have control of size, basically how big is this thing going to be, and I just made it super huge, as we can see. And then hardness, which the lower we make this value, the more opaque the halo is going to be. So we could say bring the hardness all the way down to 0, and then adjust the alpha value. And so now we've got some pretty interesting effects going on here. Let's go ahead and, in addition to this a single halo object point, let's go ahead and add another cube here and bring this over. And with this new cube selected in the material tab here, let's click on this button here, which will allow us to use any material that already exists in the file. So let's just give it that material we were using. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and rename this material something useful, something like Halo Matte. Okay, so now if we press render preview down here, we're very close to that. Let's move this cube over a bit so it's not so close to that original one. And this way we can kind of have an example what one vertex point using the halo material looks like and several vertex points. So let's drop the size down. This, here we go. That's a bit better. And then of course we can control the color here. So we can change that like that. The seed and this add value are going to affect these options down here. So let's get into those first. So first we can turn on rings for our halo object. As you can see there, we can increase the amount of rings, make this size a bit bigger so we can see it better in our material preview here. Right now there's 4. We could drop that down to 1. As you can see, now they just have 1 ring, or we could make a bunch of rings. And then we have lines, which you can see here, creating these lines in the halo effect, which is sweet. You can also control how many of those going on there. Once again, these values, like most values in Blender, are animatable. So, you could press I to insert a keyframe on that value, drag your timeline down, bring these lines up to something crazy, press I again to insert another keyframe. And as I drag this timeline down, you can see it in the render preview slowly getting smaller and smaller. We won't be able to actually see this live playback if I were to press play, I don't think, but I think you get the basic idea there. I'll go ahead and press X to delete those keyframes and turn these lines back up. And then we have star tips, which are similar to the lines, but they're sort of gradiented out and made translucent. So if we went ahead and hide the lines and the rings, we can see the star tips here, which we can control the sizes of, which is pretty sweet. And of course, we can set the colors of the rings to anything we want, turn those back on, as well as the lines. So real quickly, we can start getting some really neat effects with these halos. Okay, so I mentioned a second ago that this seed and add value, these will affect these options down here. So basically, if we have all of these options disabled and we increase the seed value or adjust this add value, it's not going to do anything. These values are only concerned with these options here. But if we activate these again, what the seed value does is randomizes the placement and rotation and alignment of these various rings, lines, and star tips. So if we increase the seed value a few times, notice that we get variation in our rings, lines, and star tips, which is pretty cool. This would be another thing that would probably be pretty fun to have animated throughout your animation. So, it could be like all these things twinkling and going really crazy, which would be super cool. And then we have this add value, which is basically a layering effect. But you can see how animating all these things together and then rendering that out could produce some pretty cool things. And then, of course, you can have the actual objects using the halo material moving, expanding, and what have you, which is, of course, really sweet too. So moving along with these options here, we have texture, which will allow us to imprint a texture over each iteration of the halo material. And we haven't really talked about textures yet, but in the next video, we're going to be discussing Blender Render textures, which the main function of most textures is to allow us to put images onto our materials. But another huge aspect of textures, and if I click on this texture tab over here, this will let us look at all the textures belonging to whatever material our object happens to be using here. Another huge part of textures, in addition to being the thing that allows us to put images and such onto our materials, are procedural textures, which are textures that don't come from like a specific image, like a JPEG or a PNG or something, but rather they're generated by the computer to do really cool things. So we could create a texture for this material here, and textures can be used in different places around Blender. They can be used for the background world environment. They can be used for brushes, for painting when we get into that. But you want to make sure that if you're using a texture for the material, such as this halo material, that when you're on the texture tab, you have this option selected here. And so just like in the material tab, we have access to every material in the file that we want to use. We can click on that button to get access to that. We can also get access to all the textures that exist in the file by clicking this, which of course there are none right now, so there's nothing in there. Just want you to be aware of that. So if we were to press new here and change this type from image or movie, which is typically the way that we use textures, to one of these procedurally generated textures, which just do cool stuff and they don't need an actual big image file to work from. So something like clouds here. So now our material possesses this single texture here called texture. We could go ahead and rename that to clouds, since that's the type we're using. This material now has this single texture, and if we click back on material under the halo options, if we click texture, we'll now be able to see the effect of that cloud texture on the halo, although currently we're not seeing much of it. If we were to go ahead and hide these rings, lines, and star tips, we can see the effect of that texture a bit more there, and maybe increase this hardness value too, because it was a bit tight. And so now we can see the sweet effect of these clouds on our halo effect, which is pretty cool. Notice it's got this kind of pinkness to it. That's because by default the clouds texture is set up to display as pink, but if we click under influence, we'll notice we have these options for halo and then blend. So the blend options are normally there. However, the halo options will only show up if you are using the material type of halo there. But we can adjust the color value here like this. We could press RGB to intensity, which would allow us to control the color. And we could switch this to, say, white if we wanted to, make this darker or what have you. We can also allow the texture to control various other aspects of the halo. Let's see. These values give us control over the values on the halo material type, which control the lines, the star tips, and etc. But I'll go ahead and shut those off so we can just see the texture for now. Maybe we could switch this color, the default color of the material, to, say, something white like this. So now we've almost got kind of like a puff of smoke here from these halo materials. And back in the texture, we could close up the influence and under the actual clouds option itself. So this is like controlling the math stuff that's actually generating this cloud texture. Got these various different kind of options for the way this cloud texture is presented. So we can get all kinds of sweet effects. We can control the size here. The depth, which basically refers to how many times is the effect repeated within itself. Sort of like when we talked about the depth value of reflections in regular Blender render materials. They're referring to how many times should one thing reflect on another, etc. Yeah, so you can use this using these generated textures such as, clouds or stucky, different things like this, of course. Or of course you can use actual images to kind of be created via these halo effects. And you can actually, even though the halo material type's only available for Blender render, you can actually use render layers, which will allow you to render your regular cycles scene if you're using the cycles render engine, and then overlay halo effects onto your cycles render image or animation. So there's a lot of really neat things that we can do with this. So I'm going to go ahead and turn rings, lines, and star tips back on. So now we've got just something really crazy here. Maybe adjust this color and make it red or something. Wow, that looks pretty neat. And so vertex normal can be used to control the dimensions of the halo effect based on the normal. That's basically means the direction in which the mesh point is facing. And then extreme alpha, I'm not really sure what that means. I know it must affect the alpha value, the transparency basically in some way, I'm assuming. And then we have shaded, which this is supposed to make it to where like things like shadows and lighting and stuff from other things in the scene can affect the halo material, even though vice versa doesn't work that way. Although I've yet to really see that be the case. So if we turn this on, we'll see a change in the way that it's rendered out. But if I were to turn off my render preview button, press Shift A, add a plane or something, and well, I've got lamps and things set up in this scene by default. So if I turn the scene brightness back up here and we press preview again, we're supposed to be able to see this lamp here, which is casting shadows and things, affect this halo material, although I'm not really seeing that happen. Bring the lights value down a little bit. So if we click back on an object using our halo material so we can get back to its properties, it's supposed to be being affected. So for instance, if I add like a monkey shape here, press G to grab, scale this thing up, we can see that the monkey is casting a shadow onto the ground. However, nothing appears to be really casted onto the halo. Yeah, I'm not really sure why that doesn't work that way. I assume that's what shaded is for, but it doesn't appear to. But that's another option if you want to toy around with it. So if we click back on the object using the material, so we've got this soft value, which says that it can soften the edges of halos at intersections with other geometry. So I'm assuming it means, you know, like this plane or the monkey. So if we say maybe make the size of this huge and come down here, maybe bring these lights down a little bit. So the idea here is that these edges should be, say for instance, where this halo is cutting into this plane right here, where we can see the shadow of the monkey head. The idea here would be that the edges where these meet get softer. So if we press that, it's not cutting through the geometry so much. But adversely though, it appears to just be covering the surface of the entire image. So I guess that's available if you want that. The flare effect is super cool. This will allow you to use the halo material type as basically an artificial lens flare, like the type you see in movies when people are out in space looking at the glare of the earth or something like that, which is really sweet. Well, before we do that, let's go ahead and start up a new file here because we're getting a little bit muddy. So I'm going to go ahead and File and press New here, Reload Startup File. Press X to delete that cube. Let's press Shift A and let's add a UV sphere. Press S to scale it up pretty big. Tap W a few times to give it some smoothing. And okay, so imagine we have a lamp over here. So we could press Shift A and under lamp, add a point lamp here. G to grab, middle mouse to constrain. And I'll back my camera out here just a little bit. And under lights, I'll go ahead and turn the default lights all the way down to 0. Press my render preview button. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the visibility of my camera on so I can see where it's actually at. And okay, so there's the camera over there. So what I would want is for the light to be coming in the opposite side. So I'll press 5 to go into top view. There's my camera. Here's my Earth type, maybe a planet or something. Put this over here. And G to grab. And let's increase the energy of this lamp over here in the object properties to say 15. And I think we need to increase the fall off distance from 25 to about 250. And if we bring it up here some, okay, so what we've got is so sort of like this light hitting the edge of this planet. Maybe we can turn our default lamps up just a little bit, maybe to like 0.3 or something, and we could move this point lamp back. Okay, so say we've got the sun hitting some planet or something like that, and we wanted to use a lens flare. What we could do is right-click our cursor to where the lamp creating the lighting is, and we could press Shift A, and under Mesh, add a cube, press Tab to go into edit mode, and press M to merge this down to a single vertex point because that's all we need. So we would press at center, and then press Tab to go back into object mode. Maybe go ahead and rename this cube lens flare so we don't get confused later on. Then under material, we would press new, and we could go ahead and rename this material to lens flare here. Switch it to type of halo, and turn our preview open so we can maybe see what's going on there. Click this top option here so we can just see the one flare there. Under our halo options, we could increase the size of this and maybe adjust this hardness some. Maybe change the color a bit. Add some rings, add some lines, add some star tips, something like this. Maybe bring the alpha down so it's not so bright. Increase the size. Okay, so we've got this lens flare object selected. We could like bring it down maybe a little bit, maybe bring that spot lamp down some too. Okay, so we've got something like this. Now the halo material is, you're almost halfway there for doing a lens flare, even on its own. But if we click back on the lens flare object so we can see our lens flare halo material here, and we turn on flare, this will give us options for actual flares showing up on our camera. Now keep in mind, this won't actually show up during a render preview, which can be annoying because it's hard to figure out where you want things. In addition to, sometimes you just forget that the lens flare won't show up in the render preview, only when you render. So keep that in mind. It's pretty much only for when you render, otherwise you won't see the effects of it. If we go ahead and press the render button, we'll get our basic flare here, but if we increase these sub flares and then press render again, there, you can see the second sub flare right there, whereas we can't really see that in our render preview, which is kind of annoying. But what we can do is increase this boost, increase the seed, which is the offset of the flare, and of course we increase the total amount of sub flares, so we could switch it up to maybe 4, adjust the sub size. That's basically the extra flares that will show up once you render. And so if we were to press render now, we've got several extra little flare things showing up. So if I compare the first one, which only had 1 sub flare, which basically just thinks of it as the initial thing, and then 2, where we set this to 2, but we didn't adjust any settings, and then 3, we get like this. So if we were to move this around to a different angle, these would show up in the appropriate places. So if I press, go ahead and increase this boost some, maybe increase their size as well, and the sub size, and then press render again. Oh, well, we went a little crazy on this one. So the size, that's our first initial flare there. We want that one not too big, and the sub size maybe, maybe just a bit bigger. And maybe bring the boost down a little bit. And let's try rendering that out. And I can hardly see him. I brought that boost way down too little. Let's try it again. There we go. Pretty sweet. Of course, we can adjust these alpha values, make this much less obvious, do something like that. So if we were to go ahead and render out an animation with, say, the camera panning around, these lens flares would all be placed in the appropriate offset to create that kind of camera lens flare effect. So I'm kind of curious now what this might look like if we went ahead and textured this lens flare. So let's turn on texture, and under texture here, make sure this is clicked on the material tab here, which means we will get the textures for our active material and not for the environment or something like that. Press new, and we could switch this from image or movie to magic here, which is basically just generates some kind of pattern for us. So if we come down here and press our render preview button, we'll see our one halo material there. Of course, we can't, when we have this set to lens flare mode, we'll only see the actual additional lens flares from that thing when we render and not during a render preview. Or we could switch this to clouds here, and under influence, turn on RGB to intensity and adjust this color and adjust the size of these clouds. And back under the material tab, turn on the alpha value so we can actually see the effects here. Let's see what this would look like, this lens flared out, using a texture over the lens flare, just out of curiosity. So when we render out the image using the lens flare option, the flares from the lens flare won't use the texture we put on the halo material, but still generates a pretty sweet effect there. Finally, to wrap this up, we have strand settings. And these strand settings refer to using a particle system that uses strands, which basically means like hair. Of course, you could also think of particle strands as like fur or grass or weeds or anything like that. So we haven't really talked about particle systems, but we'll go ahead and add a very simple one just so we can demonstrate some of these strand options for the halo. So if I'll press go back here, and I'm going to go ahead and press File, New, Reload Startup File. And I'll just give this basic cube a simple particle system here. Change the type from emitter to hair. And then under emission here, decrease this size. Then I'm going to go ahead and tap W a few times to give this cube some smoothing. Okay, so now if under material, we add a new one. And we switch this material type to halo. And we come down here and let's go ahead and turn our lights down so we'll be able to see it real good. And we press render preview button. You can see now that everywhere this hair exists, the halos are being rendered on top of the hair. So if I were to say, press T to bring up my tool shelf and press my particle paint button and tap space to select length here and then X to scale and just grow out some of this hair here. And I could press space and select the comb, comb some of this stuff. Maybe out crazy like this. Maybe cut some of it. Select the cut brush, just cut some random stuff here. Okay, so now down in our render preview, if I press render preview, we can see this halo material affecting the strands here in a super crazy looking way. So if under the material, under halo, we could adjust the color. We could give it rings, lines, make these different colors. And real quickly, we've got some otherworldly, amazing looking stuff. We could decrease the alpha value here. Finally, under this strand option here, we have control of like the root size. That's the beginning of the hair, so we could make that real big. The tip size, that's where the hair ends, so we could make that real small. Try to zoom in on a single piece of hair here so we can get a better example. The width fade, which controls even more how much the hair will fade towards the tip, and so on. So I could, back here in particle brush mode, use my length, try to grow out just maybe one particular one of these hairs here. There we go. And here we have this one super long particle hair coming out here, which is pretty sweet. Looks like some sort of crazy globular cluster of nebula or something insane we might find out in space one day. So that about wraps us up for the halo material types, and this concludes our study on all 4 of the basic Blender render material types. In the next video, we will discuss textures in general, which textures are housed inside of our Blender materials and allow us to put images onto things, in addition to create really interesting patterns and stuff like that that we can use to fake realistic things like dirt or bricks or different material surfaces. So that's coming up soon, and then finally we'll leave the Blender rendering engine behind and head over to the world of cycles. But for now, it's really great that you've been following along and getting this basic foundation of Blender's internal render engine. So thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.